Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the 8th video in our free Greenland paddle building series. In this video, we're going to talk about trimming the shoulders, marking out the blade tapers, and then we're going to cut those tapers using a bandsaw or a power planer. Now remember, this is a series, so if you haven't done this already, make sure that you go back and at least watch the introduction video. I'll throw a link up on the screen for that right now, and you can find the entire playlist with all these videos in order here on the channel. You can also find this entire series for free without any commercials on my website. And then, as always, if you want to support the free content that we put out here, think about picking up a set of our paddle plans, checking out our skin-on-frame boat building courses, buying your next piece of paddling gear from us, or just making a donation. You can find all that stuff on our website, and there are links in the video description below. And of course, if you have any thoughts or any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments. All right, enjoy the video. So next thing we're going to do is carefully trim off the shoulders. We're going to clean up this rough edge from the bandsaw or the jigsaw, and then we're going to mark a center line, we're going to mark some taper lines, and then we're going to cut the blade shape in the other axis with either a bandsaw or a power planer. So coming in close on the shoulder here, you want to grab your square, and you're going to square this line across the edge of the paddle really carefully. And then you want to grab a Japanese saw, and we're going to very carefully cut this piece of wood off. And once you get almost all the way down, you want to stop, you want to look at it carefully, and you want to go really slow here to finish this off. Because you don't want to nick your loom at all. Even if you cut into this a 1/16 of an inch right here, it is going to dramatically weaken your paddle. So just make sure that you're super careful cutting down so you don't accidentally nick the loom. And you're going to do this on all 4 shoulders. So next thing we're going to do is clean up the rough cuts from the bandsaw. And the easiest way to do this is just to grab a power planer and set it so it's not taking off very much material. And then you're just going to very carefully cut all the way down this surface, and it should leave it nice and smooth. Now, before you do this, however, it's a good idea to grab your square and just make sure that your paddle is clamped down square to the table. Now, if for whatever reason your jigsaw or your bandsaw didn't cut straight and this is clamped down to your table at a little bit of an angle, easiest way to fix that is just to grab this little offcut from your shoulder, and then you can release your clamp and you can push this underneath like a little shim, and that can get this on here a little bit straighter. Now, after that, you just want to look down the line here and see if you've got any really dramatic high spots where you came away from the line in the upward direction. And if you do, before you get out your power planer, I would just recommend grabbing your block plane really quick, and you can just knock down those high spots. That way, you've got a nice smooth path for the power planer. Now, if you don't feel comfortable with a power planer, you can come in here and do this same work with a hand plane. Now, because this is our first time working with a power planer in this video, I want to do a quick demonstration on this test piece to show you how to avoid a couple common mistakes. So first up here, like I said before, if you've got any really big high spots, you can just come in here with your block plane and plane those down. Next, you can grab your power planer, and the important thing about a power planer is, one, just make sure that it's not set too deep. And the things you need to be careful about when you're planing is that you want to make sure that you're both coming in and also coming off the end nice and straight. Because if you come in at a little bit of an angle, I'm going to show you what happens. See that? That is obviously bad news. You can see how even if you're a little bit off angle, it can really chew up the end of your cut. So you want to make sure you're coming in nice and straight. And the same thing is true at the other end, because if you come off and you just let the nose of it fall, it's going to cut this as well. So I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but it took an 1/8 of an inch chunk out of the end right here, which really starts to compromise the height of our shoulder. So the way to avoid those two things is that when you're coming into your cut, you want to make sure you keep pressure on the front of the power planer. And then when you're coming out of your cut, you want to make sure that you push down with the heel of your hand so you're keeping pressure on the heel of the power planer so the nose doesn't drop. Now, another thing to pay attention to when you're clamping this down is just make sure that your clamp is at least 5 inches back on the loom here. That way the power planer can actually finish the cut. So doing this for real, I'm going to set this to a 32nd of an inch, but like I said, if you don't have a lot of experience with a power planer, you should probably go with a 64th. And I'm just going to come in from the end. So coming in really close on the root of the blade, when you're done with this process, it should look something like this. You can see that I've cut halfway through the black line on the loom, although like I mentioned before, you can also just leave the black line on the loom and then trim it down a little bit later with hand tools. And then after I'm done smoothing down this surface right here, I'm about halfway through this black line as well. Now, if you have to cut a little bit deeper right here, that's fine. Just make sure that you don't cut any deeper than the actual line itself. And what we're looking to maintain here is a 1/4 of an inch of height for the shoulder. It's okay if it's a little bit more than that, but you really don't want to have less than that. And keep in mind that measurement is actually from the center of this black line right here, just in case you've cut a little bit wider than that. So once you've smoothed down all 4 edges, next thing we're going to do is mark a center line with a Sharpie on both edges and around the ends. So the easiest way to do this is to take your combination square and set it to a little bit less than half the width of this piece. And then just like we did when we were marking out the loom, you can hold the combination square like this, hold the Sharpie line like this, and pull it all the way down the edge. Now, before you commit to this, you want to check to make sure it's right. And easy way to do that is just to go ahead and make a mark like this, and then flip your combination square over and check it on the other side. And if it's not perfectly lined up on both edges of that dot, you're going to have to make an adjustment here. So once you're sure that this is exactly in the center, you can just go ahead and set this like this, take your Sharpie, and then you can pull all the way down the blade. And around the end as well. And then when you go to mark out the other side of this, don't flip this over like this, because if your line is even slightly offline, that means it's going to put the center line axis of your blades a little bit skewed from each other. So what you want to do instead is when you're done marking this, you want to flip the entire paddle blank like this, and then you'll do the other side right here. So you're going to do this on all 4 edges, and you're going to do it around the ends. So next you're going to want to grab a straight edge, and we're going to mark out the blade tapers. And then coming out to the end of the paddle, I'm just going to grab this little offcut from my shoulder, and I'm going to use that to set my combination square. And you're going to set your combination square at approximately 3/8 of an inch, but it might be a little different than that. And you're going to mark on one side, and then you're going to mark on the other. And then you're going to measure the distance from the center of this line to the center of this line right here. And I'm always changing my mind a little bit on what I think the perfect distance is for this. So if you have a set of my Greenland paddle plans, I would check the most recent tip diagram. And then I'm going to come to my actual paddle, and I'm going to mark that right towards the tip on both sides. And you can carry these lines down the ends as well. And then next you want to set your straight edge on the mark at the tip of the paddle. And then you're going to slide the front of the straight edge sideways until it's all the way at the outside of the shoulder, just like we did when we were cutting the outline of the paddle. Now, I usually don't use a clamp for this, but if you want to clamp this down to keep it from moving, that's fine. And then you're going to take your Sharpie and mark like this. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. So this is what this should look like when you're done, and we're going to do this on both ends and both sides. And then next up here, we're going to cut this wood and this wood off right here. So I'm going to show you how to cut these tapers with a bandsaw first, and then I'm going to show you an alternate way that you can do it with a power planer. And if you're doing this with a bandsaw, the most important thing is to make sure that your bandsaw can actually make this cut nice and straight, because this is a fairly tall cut right here, and if your bandsaw is at a little bit of an angle, or if it has a tendency to wander, it's really easy to screw up your paddle blank to where you're not going to be able to use it. So if you have any doubts about your bandsaw, I would recommend doing exactly what we did when we were cutting out the other shape, and just getting yourself a piece of scrap wood. You could even use the same piece if you have it, and you can mark out the tapers, and you can practice to make sure that you've got good technique and also that your saw is cutting nice and straight. Now, the acceptable range of deviation here would be if you're cutting to the outside of the line on the top and that you've cut through the line on the bottom. But if you've cut so far at an angle that you cut over to this other line, for example, then you've basically ruined your paddle blank. So just make sure that you're cutting straight before you start cutting for real. And the other place I see people get into trouble is they accidentally feed this into the saw at a little bit of an angle. And the reason that happens is usually because they're a little bit too tense, they're holding the piece of wood really tightly, and even though they're really focused on the line, they're not noticing that they're tipping the blank just a little bit. So when you go to run this into the saw, just make sure that you're paying attention that it's actually sitting flat on the table. And just like we did when we were cutting the outline, you want to cut along the outside of these lines. And just keep in mind that when you get really close to the root of the blade back here, it's probably just going to pop out and it's going to leave a little spot where it didn't cut along the line. That's totally fine. You can clean that up with a planer later. So coming back from the bandsaw, hopefully you've managed to stay outside your lines. If you cut into your lines or a little bit through your lines here and there, that's usually not a problem, but you want to try to do your best. Now, the next thing we're going to do is clean up this surface with a power plane. But before I do that, I usually come to this area right here because usually the bandsaw skips out a little bit right as you're nearing the end of the cut, which leaves a little bit of a high spot. So easy way to break that down is just to grab yourself a block plane. If you're carving on a vertical grain paddle, usually you can get away with planing uphill like this. But if you're carving on a flat grain paddle, you're probably going to want to come downhill like this so you don't catch the grain. So I'm just going to knock down this little high spot really quick. All right, good deal. Now, the amount of work that you need to do with your power planer here just depends on how well you did or didn't do with the bandsaw. If you've cut almost all the way through your lines, you're going to want to set your power planer to a very fine setting and just do your best to smooth this out without cutting too deep. And what you're looking for here is you want to try to cut halfway through these black lines. But once again, if you cut to the bottom of the black lines, that is okay, but you definitely don't want to cut any further. Now, just a quick technique tip for finishing off a power planer cut without leaving a little ledge. The way you can do that is as you're coming down your cut and you're getting to the end of where you want to cut, you can lift up the back of the power planer slowly, but let it keep riding forward on the nose like this. And that's going to feather the plane up and out of the cut as opposed to just stopping it and leaving a little divot. Also, you want to make sure that your clamps are set back far enough that you can actually finish this cut with the power plane. And then finally, before you start your cut, remember, you want to make sure you're coming in nice and straight with the power planer, because if you're coming in at a little bit of an angle, it's going to really chew up the end of your blank. So now, taking a look at the end here, the power planer is actually a little bit narrower than the tip of the blade, which means it's going to leave a little ledge on one side or both sides. And if you're only taking one pass, you can just leave these and these will disappear in the next step. But if you're going to be doing more than one pass with the power planer, you just want to come in here really quick and get rid of these little ledges before you do the next pass. Otherwise, the edge of the power planer will ride up on that and it's not going to cut straight. Now, another thing to point out is if you've planed this down halfway through the black line or at a maximum to the bottom of the black lines and you could still see a little bit of curve from the bandsaw, you don't want to keep planing and over thin your paddle. If you've just got a couple low spots like this, don't worry, those will disappear through the other steps that we're going to do next. You definitely don't want to keep cutting your paddle too thin. Now, in this case, I do still have some room to plane down, so I'm just going to hit this with a power planer really quick, and this is going to disappear. So the other way that you can cut these tapers is with a power planer. And the way this works is you're going to set your power planer fairly aggressive, and then you're going to take progressively longer swipes starting at the end. So you're going to take a short swipe, and then a longer swipe, and a longer swipe, and that's going to develop into a taper. Now, as far as exactly how long those swipes need to be, it just depends on how deep your planer is set. And so it's the sort of thing that while you're doing this, you're going to have to monitor how much you're taking off by looking at your black lines. And if it seems like you're taking off a little too much at the end in the beginning, you can make your swipes a little bit longer. On the other hand, if it seems like you're cutting a little too far towards the back, you can make your swipes a little bit shorter or take a few more extra swipes at the front. Now, just like we talked about when we were cleaning up the edge, be aware that you want to keep pressure on the back of the plane as you're coming off the end here, so you don't accidentally dive over the end and damage the end right here. Also, the end of this paddle blank is a little bit wider than the 3¼ inch blade on this power planer. And what that means is that occasionally you're going to have to take an extra swipe or two off to the side just to knock down that ledge. Now, the important thing is that while you're doing this, you're monitoring the lines on both sides so you don't accidentally cut too far or cut it at a weird angle. Now, once you get close to your lines here, say within a 1/16 of an inch, I would recommend backing your power planer off to at least a 32nd of an inch and then finishing it up that way just so you don't accidentally cut through your lines. Now, this is a good teachable moment because you saw at the end there, the chips were actually shooting out the bottom instead of the side. And what that means is that you've got a chip clog. And you don't want to keep working with a chip clog because it's not going to cut very well. So the way to deal with that is just to take your planer up off of your workpiece and then turn it on. And at the same time that you're running it, you want to jiggle the chip diverter back and forth like this, and that's going to cause that clog to shoot out one side or the other. So just keep in mind, if you see that, you want to clear that clog before you keep going. Now, just a quick technique tip. If you end up in a situation like I am right here, where you've cut almost all the way through the black line at the end of the paddle or the root of the blade, but you've still got a high spot in the middle right here, the way that you can deal with that with a power planer is you can set the planer to a very fine setting, and then you can slowly feather into and out of that cut by letting the planer ride along the nose of the plane only, and then slowly dropping the heel down into the cut. And then when you want to be done, you can slowly lift the heel back up again. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this in front of you real quick. So taking a look at the finished product, whether you're using a bandsaw or a power planer, ideally you want to be about halfway through these black lines on the sides right here. If you go a little bit further than that, it's not the end of the world, but you definitely don't want to cut any deeper than the inside edge of your black lines. Now, once you've planed both faces, another check you can do right now is to measure the thickness of the paddle out at the end and also the thickness halfway between the end and the root of the blade. And I'm going to tell you what my measurements are for this paddle here today, but keep in mind this is not gospel. I'm always changing my mind on these, and also these heights change depending on the size of paddle that I'm building. So if you're looking for much more detailed sizing recommendations, you can always check the Greenland paddle plans. But for the paddle I'm working on right now, I am 9/16 of an inch thick at the tip. And then if I come back along the blade, this blade just happens to be 33 1/4 inches long. So I'm going to come back 16 5/8. And it looks like this is just a little bit under 1 1/8 inches thick. But keep in mind, this can change depending on the species of wood and also the size of the paddle that I'm building. And then once this is smooth and you're happy with your measurements, we're going to draw a center line on all 4 faces. So I usually just mark center up here at the loom without measuring. And then I measure halfway across at the tip, double check it, drop your straight edge on top of it, and then you can connect these marks with your Sharpie.